Ladies and gentlemen, this is William Holly at WBH Radio. Thanks for tuning in. We got a very special guest joining us here today. He is a professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky, the great Dr. Derrick E. White. Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm excellent. I want to first say thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time. Dr. White is the author of a book I just finished. Have it right here on the screen. It's called Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Gaither, Florida A&M, and the History of Black College Football. First and foremost, Dr. White, congratulations on this great piece of scholarship. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm glad happy to be here. Glad you're having me. It's always exciting to talk to folks, the good folks in New York.
Dr. White, I got a doctorate back in spring of 2021, doctorate of education, and all I've thought about since then is writing a book. Can you tell me about the moment you put this finished product, hardcover, in your hands? What was that like?
Oh man, it is having done a couple of these, it's the best feeling in the world. You work on these for a long time, man. Everybody's like, I think we get confused because politicians and celebrities, they like, I got a book coming out, and they announce that they doing a book, and then the book come out in like a year.
Right.
But on the scholarly side, man, those are labors of love, as we like to say. They take I think this book probably took me about 7 or 8 years just to do all the research and writing and editing and, covering my bases and talking to folks. And so when you get it in your hand, man, it's like a child, man. It's like it's your baby, whereas your real kids grow up and then they don't want nothing to do with you. Your books still love you. That's the way I like it.
Very nice, very nice. And this book came out in August in 2019. And Dr. White, you are a scholar and you know what it takes to put something like this together. Can you tell me about the moment you made up your mind or the motivation came to write this book? You said, you know what, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, I at the time, I was teaching at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida, and I had gotten permission to teach a sports class that they had not had offered. And so I'm teaching a sports history class, and I'm giving students what I called kind of institutional biographies on the various programs. And so the state of Florida is really kind of a great place to do this kind of project, in the sense that there are a lot of programs, right? There are old schools like the University of Florida and Florida A&M. There's private schools like Miami. There are new universities, Florida Atlantic, South Florida, Central Florida. And so you could talk about the history of sports at those institutions, and it varies at different points because of their start date. Well, students come back to me, they got Florida A&M, and they're like, I don't have nothing to write about Florida A&M. And no, students they will tell you that they can't find anything. Sure. And I was like, I don't believe you. Like, Florida A&M's got this huge, robust history. I know that Gaither was in the College Football Hall of Fame. My brother had been, had graduated from Florida A&M, so I knew a decent amount about the program. And they just kept coming back, but there was no real scholarly kind of information. And so I was like, that cannot be. And so I used their kind of lack of materials as a really kind of spur me to begin to do this research. I was in the state, and it made a lot of the early research much easier to accomplish.
Okay. I learned so much reading this book. It's not just Black history, because as we know, Black history is American history, but it's sport history. I learned a lot about leadership. I learned a lot about coaching. I learned a lot about sports administration. And I got kind of overwhelmed thinking about putting this podcast together. Like, where would we begin? So I said, I'm going to ask the author, what would you say is the number one thing you want readers to know after finishing this book?
One, there's two things I think I wanted to do. One is I wanted to undercut this idea that somehow the University of Miami, the U, or Florida, the University of Florida, their great run in the 2000s, like somehow they were the pinnacle of college football in the state of Florida. And I wanted to remind readers that Florida A&M was the original powerhouse in that state. And then two is I wanted them to think a little bit about how Black coaches managed and facilitated in creating these programs. I think there's a lot of my thinking was a lot of naturalism about this, in the sense that black athletes are somehow black student athletes are natural athletes, and thus, of course, Florida A&M had a great program,
Mhm.
of course. And so what that does is that it undermines the kind of coaching acumen and recruiting acumen that someone like Jay Gaither or Eddie Robinson or John Merritt or
Mhm.
any other great black coaches had, and it reduces them in stature when they're compared to their white counterparts, Bear Bryant or a Nick Saban in the
Mhm.
modern sense, right? And and I think that it's very clear that one of the things I wanted to do is to make sure that Jay Gaither in particular, but black college coaches, HBCU coaches of that generation, get their kind of flowers and accolades for the kind of geniuses that they were.
You did that. Jay Gaither, he was a longtime head coach at Florida A&M. How would you describe Mr. Jay Gaither?
Jay Gaither's is in many ways he is the first real kind of dominant program, and I think that I say this in the sense that there were some great coaches before him: Cleve Abbott, Billy Nix at Prairie View. Eddie Robinson is both a contemporary and lasts considerably longer. But in that run, that 25-year run, one of the things that became abundantly clear in the research and the approach was that that national titles, if you wanted to win a black college national title, it came through Tallahassee, right? It came through Florida A&M. And M.
Yes.
And so many of those great programs, Eddie Robinson wins his first national title by defeating Jay Gaither in the Orange Blossom Classic, right? Like,
Mhm.
this is how other coaches had to measure their success, right? And so when you're that dominant, in many ways, I like it in the contemporary. I mean, is the way we think about Alabama right now, right?
Right.
That, like, a successful season for Georgia last year meant that they had to go through Alabama. Like,
Mhm.
this is the way. And so even if Alabama doesn't win, we know that they are always in the conversation. And that's what Florida A&M becomes for really about, for 25 to 30 years. And because they had the Orange Blossom Classic, which was basically the Rose Bowl of black college football,
Right.
it became the de facto national title game. And so in some ways, Jay Gaither in this is a critical cog, right?
Mhm.
Eddie Robinson gets all the flowers, and deservedly so, in part because he coaches almost twice as long as Jay Gaither, like almost nearly 50 years
Eddie Robinson was at Grambling State
at,
University.
at Grambling
Right.
State University. And so Eddie and Grambling have this different kind of reputation, in part because Eddie Robinson produces more pro NFL players than anybody else of a school that size. Plus, Eddie Robinson coaches well into the, like, 1990s, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
this is,
He had
like,
he had
so
a Burger King commercial.
right, exactly. And so Grambling is a unique story, and an important story. And so I would always say that Eddie Robinson, if we're just doing rankings, Eddie Robinson is the most dominant HBCU coach.
Right.
He is he's the godfather, but Jay Gaither is a close second. And that run between 47 and 69, that 25 years that he had, 45 and 69, is a really an amazing run.
Amazing run. Okay, Dr. White, let's get a few of the numbers straight. You said Jay Gaither's run is from which years? 45
To
to
69.
69. And much of that time, the college football sport was segregated.
In the South, it was almost exclusively segregated until, so in the SEC, the University of Kentucky desegregates the SEC in 1966, I believe.
Right.
And so you're really talking about at the very end of his career as a coach, there are desegregated teams in the South. So he plays the University of Tampa
Mm-hmm.
in 1969, which is really the first integrated team that he plays,
Mm-hmm.
and is like his second to last game as coach.
As coach. You talked about you wanted to highlight that there were some black coaches that really helped to change the game. It wasn't just athletes' natural ability. And again, Jake Gaither, and I said I learned a lot about coaching. I learned a lot about leadership. Jake Gaither kind of started the coaching clinic. Like he said, I'm going to train coaches in my community. I'm going to train the high school coaches. So by the time the players get to the college level, they have the tools and the skills that I need them to have. I thought this was
Mm-hmm.
great. Dr. White, I'm a local high school coach. I'm going to start going to the junior high school coaches. Let's put a coaching clinic together so the athletes can have the tools and the basics. What are some other elements that he added to the coaching profession, especially down there and when it comes to the black community?
Yeah, so the coaching clinic is, I think, one of the vital things. Like, across America, white coaches had coaching clinics. So like the coaching clinic wasn't unusual.
Mm-hmm.
But what Jake Gaither does for HBCUs is that he doesn't create the first coaching clinic, but he creates the most organized and the longest running coaching clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that he does is has an integrated coaching clinic. And so coaches from University of Florida, Florida State, uh, uh, Woody Hayes from Ohio State's there. Bear Bryant's there as an assistant coach. So all the great coaches of that era spend some time in Tallahassee going over X's and O's. And I think that one of the things that it does for black coaches, and Gaither in particular, is that they get to compare their knowledge against these guys who are getting all these kinds of accolades, and they realize that they are good coaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they know these kinds of things. There's a great letter I found. One of my favorite examples was that Howard, who was the coach Howard, who was the coach at Clemson, where Howard's Rock, where they run down the hill
Okay.
at Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
Howard was a notorious racist, right? Like Daryl Hill, who was the first black player at the University of Maryland, talked about the kind of ordeal that he had when he showed up at Clemson, where the coach was actually calling him all kinds of N-words.
Right.
But Howard is at the coaching clinic with Jake Gaither in the summer. So some of it makes me think that some of this racism was both real and performative for his boosters.
Right.
But he goes to this coaching clinic and he writes a letter back after the coaching clinic. And he says to Coach Gaither, "Thank you for fixing my run game."
Mm-hmm.
Right. Basically, he was having problems in blocking his run game, and Coach Gaither had given him this pointers that worked. And so we get a kind of window into the ways that Jake Gaither was a great X's and O coach.
Yes.
And this gets played out probably most significantly in what he calls the split line T formation. And so this is going to we're going to nerd out in football.
Go for
talk
it.
here,
Let's do it.
right? But the T formation was basically the kind of what we think of now as a single wing formation that kind of comes up under George Halas and the Chicago Bears in the 1940s. By the 1940s, 1950s, everybody in the country is running single wing. I mean, the T formation. And what Jake Gaither does is he tweaks it. He basically splits his linemen out a little further. They're not all close together. They're like almost a yard and a half, 2 yards between each player. And so it looks kind of crazy the way that they're lined up when they're all the way across the field. But he does this because he's like, look, I need to change the blocking angles for my run plays because I got 4 guys in the backfield that can all run the 100-yard dash in under 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the world record was like 9 seconds. So they're all basically like near world record pace. And including one of those years is Bob Hayes, who's the fastest man in the world. Right.
Yes.
And so he's like, all I need is a crack. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so these angles are spreading the defensive line out further and further. And so he's doing this in order to unleash his backfield. And so in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he has like 4 seasons in a row where they average like 50 points a game and they don't throw the football but maybe twice or 3 times a game,
Because
right?
of this running attack.
Because running attack. These dudes are all, they're getting 800 yards.
Yeah.
He's got 3 800-yard backs. And it's like, how is that even possible? Because they're all, 3 carries for 110 yards, those
Yes.
kind of days. And so there's a kind of genius in really taking something that every coach is employing and using it to his advantage and then recruiting to that mechanism.
You mentioned here, and even in the book, when you described his coaching clinic as integrated, I was shocked because when you think of integration, you always think of black people trying to knock on white folks' door. No, this was Jake Gaither's coaching clinic, and he invited white coaches in. And it's kind of spoke to the standing he had and the level of respect and authority that was going on at the black college football level.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a word you use often in the book that growing up, it was always associated with church. You talk about sporting congregations. Dr. White, what is a sporting congregation?
A sporting congregation for me is the church was the mechanism, right? Like for black folks in the church, like this is the way we think about organizing. So the church historically is not just a place of worship, it's a place of political activism, it's a place of music, it's a place of education. It is a multi-purpose kind of location.
Mhm.
And that we should think about athletics in the same kind of way, and that what it does is that black college athletics, both in primarily in football but also included in basketball and other sports as well, serves as a similar kind of space that brings together athletes, coaches, administrators, fans, sports writers, right?
Media, yes, yes.
High school teachers, high school coaches, right? All this is happening, and these are the networks that are being built, and that folks like Gaither or Eddie Robinson or John Merritt, right? They're all basically pastors in this church, right? And so in their own communities, in their own areas, they are organizing um these athletic conventions, right? Like if
Yeah,
we think of them as like religious conventions,
right.
right? Like this is the way they're operating. And so the sporting congregation forced me to really think about not really just simply a biography of Gaither,
Mhm.
not just since an institutional kind of story of Florida A&M, but really thinking about the ways that all these groups intersected to create this great black program, this dominant program that Florida A&M was, because it can't just be coaching greatness or athletes or any of these kinds or
It's
X's and
not, Dr.
O's.
White. It's not. And that's what I enjoyed reading so much. It was like a whole community and everybody contributed. And it wasn't just athletic greatness on the field and X's and O's. So many people played a part, like we said, the high school coaches, even the college professors. What was Jay Gaither's contribution to the field of physical education?
I mean, so one of the things he does is he has a master's in physical education from The Ohio State University. And one of the things that's really interesting is that Florida as a general, but Florida A&M in particular, is really building on this kind of post-war emphasis on physical education. And so they're creating a physical education program. So he's thinking about not only am I coaching these guys as the track coach or the basketball coach or the football coach, but I'm also preparing them to become physical educators at the next level. They're
Mhm.
going back into the high schools. They're going back to become teachers, become principals, become high school coaches, become men in their communities, right? As pastors, as doctors, whatever it is, lawyers. They're coming to be kind of community or anchors. And so for him, the way that he's imagining this space, these space and his responsibility is so much bigger than athletics. And so what he's doing is that the school is just a vehicle. He's just in one area in which the entire HBCU landscape is functioning to train up generations of black men and women to improve their communities, to challenge segregation, and to try to make black people to have full and robust lives in an undemocratic world.
Character development through athletic success. That is what Mr. Gaither believed in. And I'm trying to paint the picture. Although much of the world and the country was segregated at that time, there was pride in these communities. And they were functioning and thriving and respect for one another. And everybody leaned on one another. You know, I felt great pride just reading it. Like Jay Gaither he was the college coach in the neighborhood. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he was the guy. You know, and as you mentioned, a lot of his alumni went on to be principals and teachers, and that was his network. And you know, they were really rolling.
Yeah.
What would you consider the height of Jake Gaither's run?
The early 1960s, they go. I think there's a year, like 4 years, where they go, I don't know, like 37-3, and they average like 49 points a game, and they win two national titles, and lose two of the three losses happened in the Orange Blossom Classic that keep them from winning
Mm-hmm.
national titles. Um, but Jake Gaither's like, there's a run where it's like I there that he wins the SIAC, the conference that they're in,
Mm-hmm.
23 out of the 25 years. One of those years they were co-champs. The other year they finished second and lost by a game, right? Like it is an unbelievable run of conference dominance. And then one of the things that they end up doing is that they really challenge themselves by playing the best programs year in and year out. So they're playing Southern almost every year. They're
Right.
playing Grambling almost, probably every third year they're playing Grambling. They play Prairie View out of the SWAC, because the SWAC was really probably from top to bottom the most dominant conference of that era. They're playing all those programs year in and year out, and that's how they're measuring themselves. And so Gaither, my favorite thing is they lost like 3 or 4 games one year. They sent out a press release to the media, like apologizing for losing so many games.
Yeah, yeah, they were rolling. They were rolling. With the sporting congregation, there was one example that stood out to me, and I felt like it epitomized the strength and perhaps the importance of it. Bob Hayes. Bob Hayes would win an Olympic medal. Was that 1964 100-meter dash, fastest man in the world. He would go on to play for the Dallas Cowboys, winning a Super Bowl. But when he was a little known freshman, he was arrested for a crime that many people didn't think he had committed. He had actually signed a confession while sitting in jail for a week. And once the community got a hold of it and Jake Gaither did his investigation, they went to bat for that young man and got him out of jail. And had that community not been in place, that would have been a gold medalist and a Super Bowl champion that we would have never heard of.
Yeah. I mean, Bob Hayes is the quintessential example of the sporting community, right? That his high school coach in St. Aug's was a former player at FAMU, and he had told him that we've got this young man that can, whose home life was really rough,
Right.
right? Like impoverished. His father wasn't around a lot. And so, but they knew that he had certain kind of athletic talents, but he also, that Florida A&M as an institution and Jake Gaither as a coach could bring the best out of him and give him an opportunity at having a successful life. And as you noted, that he gets arrested in the saying signs of confession, it is a tragedy. But Gaither does, Gaither knows everybody in the white community and everybody in the black community. So
Yeah.
when people like he does an investigation, what does he do? Like he calls up everybody and asks them what they say, right?
Yeah.
Like he's the most respected black person in the city of Tallahassee, and they tell him what happened. People don't lie to him, and he goes to bat. He tells the judge, he was like, "Look, you give me this young man, and I will make him a productive citizen." And the judge agrees. And so the way we think about segregation and the kind of racism that functions, of course it's there, but people like Gaither were able to tread on kind of paternalism and this kind of relationship with kind of powerful white folks that allow for them to protect and save young men like Bob Hayes. Can I say one story real quick?
Go for it.
Because the Bob Hayes thing, I'm in the early parts of this book, and this is right when Bob Hayes is about to get inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. And so the NFL Network runs this special about Bob Hayes getting and they're like, he's the most successful track guy to ever play professional football. And I was upset because like Bob Hayes was not a track guy.
Right.
Bob Hayes was a football guy. He goes to Florida A&M to play football, and they realize while he's there that he's extremely fast. Now, they have a bunch of fast players. So like a lot of the football players are already on the track team.
Right.
The assistant coach for the football team is the head track coach. He's like, "Come on over in the spring." It's only in the spring of his freshman year that they realize that not only is he fast, he's like faster than everybody we got and in the
Right.
country, right? And so they make it out to say like they imply that he's like Willie Gault or Ronaldo Nehemiah, like those track guys who played in the NFL.
Right.
When in reality, he was a football guy who ran track. If you ever see Bob Hayes run, it is not classic form, right? It is a dude who is like pigeon-toed. It is a dude who is just like built like a running back in
Right.
many ways. Powerfully built, and he just is able to turn that speed that he had in football into track speed. And so that he goes into the NFL, he was always a football guy. And I think that one of the things that we did a little bit of a disservice to his legacy in many ways by saying he was a track guy who played football rather than a football guy who ran track.
Got you. Got you. We are talking about Dr. Derrick E. White's book, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jake Gaither, Florida A&M, and the History of Black College Football. Now, Dr. White, we talked about the man Jake Gaither, how respected he was, how much of a pioneer he was in black college football. But there came a time when he was challenged by his community, and he was actually called an Uncle Tom.
Mm-hmm.
And his I guess not his love, but his love for the black community was questioned. Why?
So Jay Gaither is, he comes up. He's born at the near the beginning of the 20th century. Comes up in these black institutions, Knoxville College, St. Paul's, and eventually Florida A&M. And he builds this program after World War II. Survives 2 brain tumors and surgery. And then by the time you get to the mid 1960s, we having the whole student movement in Florida, in Tallahassee, even across the nation,
Civil rights.
calling for integration.
Mm-hmm.
And Jake Gaither had cultivated, in order to have this success, right? He cultivates this relationship with powerful white people that for those who are not aware, Tallahassee is the capital of the state of Florida. Florida A&M is literally down the street from the state capitol. So like he is talking to the governor of the state, he's talking to state senators, state congressmen, like they are coming to football games. They sit in a roped off section at the 50-yard line at Florida A&M games at key games. And he's cultivating this relationship to try to build his program to make sure that they get the resources that they need. And so this relationship runs afoul of young folks who are like, calling for Black power eventually. And they don't really like that kind of approach. And so Jay Gaither's philosophy about controlling and keeping his program in power by appealing to successful and powerful white folks in the state of Florida runs afoul of folks who are talking about self-determination. And so one of the ways I try to thread this needle and think about this is that the students are, from their perspective as teenagers, as 20-year-olds, have no experience of how Jay Gaither built that program from the ground, how those folks built the program from the ground up. And then two, that Jake Gaither was also an institutionalist. Like he's not actually calling for individual integration. He talks about how, segregation is wrong, but the way that we're doing integration is wrong as well, because he saw that if integrating meant losing Florida A&M, his football program and the institution, then we will have lost more than we have gained through integration. And so he's actually making a much more subtle argument. But at the same time, he's not a fan of Black power. He's not a fan of the way in which students are expressing themselves. He's very much an old school Black person. Like, he's a football coach. So he's like, I need you to present yourself in a particular kind of way. I don't want you wearing these afros. I don't want you attending these marches, right? And so he's very both protective of his players and his program, but at the same time, he's also trying to protect his players, his program, and the institution from what he kind of sees coming, which is the kind of loss. And so I use in the book a couple examples, but the main one is that the Negro Leagues, like he grew up when the Negro Leagues were dominant, and then he saw that after Jackie Robinson, by the time, within 5 years, the Negro Leagues are a shell of their former selves. And so, what is gained and what is lost through this process of integration, he had a clear working model while looking at the Negro Leagues.
Before integration, Jay Gaither and Florida A&M had a monopoly on the black talent coming through Florida. As far as the high school recruits, like the pipeline was going straight to his school. So, he's being criticized for not really supporting the Black Power movement, and he's kind of telling these young folks not to revolt. And the reader, I'm trying to figure out what his motivation was. Was it football related? Did he just want to keep his football institution intact? Or was he scared of repercussions? Like, I don't know, Dr. White. Like, what was the motivation? Is he Uncle Tom? Or, like, what is it?
So I think his motivations are twofold, right? Like his motivations are one, he is definitely trying to keep his football program running, but he's also very aware of keeping Florida A&M in its position, right? There is a push, and he sees this when he retires. There's this massive push for integration in the state of Florida, and state politicians are like, why do we have two schools that are like 2 miles apart? Why are Florida State and Florida A&M both in existence? Why are we paying for both of these schools when they should just merge?
Right.
And what merge means is that they're getting rid of Florida A&M and everybody's got to go to Florida State.
Right.
Right. And so he kind of understands that this is kind of what's, motivating this discussion, that, people who are all about segregation, holding the line on segregation, wake up 2 years later and they're like, oh yeah, we should integrate. That means close Florida A&M.
Mm-hmm.
And because what's really happening is that in the 1960s, as integration starts to come to the South, they're looking at the NFL rosters and they're like, the black players in the NFL had all went to Grambling, Prairie View, Texas Southern, Tennessee State, Florida A&M, and they're like, man, those players should probably go to Florida, Alabama,
Should go to the
LSU.
white schools.
Right. Like they're looking at this in a very kind of selfish way. And so the fastest way to encourage those good student athletes to come to their institution is to close the black colleges. And so this is a real threat for a lot of black colleges, is that there's a real kind of public and also quiet push to close black colleges, because now that segregation is over, we don't need these schools.
They actually closed Florida A&M's law school, right?
They do.
Another thing
and they opened one at Florida State.
Yikes. And that's one thing you pointed out in the book. I would have never considered it otherwise. Many of these schools are public institutions. Florida State, Florida A&M, Alabama's where Nick Saban is at. So they are in line for public subsidies, right? Mm-hmm. So how come there was such an imbalance? And there was one time you tell a story about Florida A&M was set to get a new stadium. Initially, they wanted 15,000 fans, and then the board came back and said, no, just take 5,000. And then the board came back and said, we'll just build you half a stadium. Like,
yeah,
why the imbalance?
I mean, racism. They have simply racism.
Yeah.
Like they are doing everything they can to prop up the flagship white institutions at the expense of HBCUs. And so you see this in the contemporary landscape. Florida students at Florida A&M just sued the state of Florida because they are owed, they've been underfunded to the tune of almost like $2 billion. And so this is really a long-standing practice. Like, one of the ways I frame this is that Florida A&M was rich in human resources, but they really lacked material resources, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what they're selling and what they sold and what they continue to sell is this community, this congregation that's going to love you. But what they're not going to be able to do often, because of this chronic underfunding, is have the brand new locker room, right? The freshest new thing. Or for regular students, the dorms are going to be old, right? Like there's just not multi-millions of dollars coming in from either donors, boosters, or through tuition. And so that kind of material imbalance is something that Gaither actually deals with. And part of his argument is like, well, why are we getting less when we're the best team in this state?
Yes. I was thinking like, well, take it to present day. Of course, Florida State gets more money. They're bigger. They're better. But that wasn't always the case. That imbalance started somewhere.
Yeah, especially Florida State. Florida State was a women's college. There was a University of Florida College for Women, and then Florida A&M, right, for Black students. Right. And then after World War II, Florida's College for Women becomes Florida State. And so Florida A&M had been a co-ed college for, at that point, 6 decades before Florida State had even thought about playing football, right? And so they're funneling lots of money into Florida State to get them kind of caught up. And part of the people who are supporting Florida State are like, we're looking at, why are we spending money on Florida A&M when we need Florida State to catch up? The state of Florida, I don't, because New York, like Florida and Florida State are such rivals that Florida refused to play Florida State for most years until 1955, where the state legislature stepped in and was required Florida to play Florida State in football. Like this is how, how much emphasis that politicians took in the kind of white sporting world. And so FAMU is getting caught in that.
Mm-hmm. With the struggle that was going on, Gaither kind of wanted people to stand pat, and then you had this revolutionary movement. And there was an individual you quoted in the book, Dr. Harry Edwards, who I have a tremendous respect for, who's still around. He's kind of like the father of sociology and sport. He would actually be with the 49ers in the 80s and helping them I guess, keep their team together. Uh, he was critical of those that wanted to kind of stand pat. Let's see what he said. He spent on it. Edwards argued that HBCU curriculum functioned to keep blacks in their place as second-class citizens. Safe educational programs allowed by whites included an emphasis on agriculture, music, and physical education. He mocked black colleges by suggesting that A&M stood for athletics and music rather than agriculture and mechanical. Now, this is a smart guy. How come they didn't view being independent as suitable?
That's a good question. You should ask Harry Edwards. No, I think part of it is. So I say this: that Harry Edwards is obviously we owe a tremendous debt of us who talk about race and sports.
Yeah.
Harry Edwards, both in his activism and as a scholarship. But I also say he also had a tremendous blind spot when it came to HBCUs, right? Like he did not see them, and so he is a person who, in some ways, I think accepted the kind of white discourse about the kind of inferiority of black colleges.
Yeah.
And in doing so, he went to San Jose State, he was at Cornell, right? So he's in these predominantly white spaces where he's getting treated as a second-class citizen. Now, if you talk to anybody who graduated from an HBCU, they'll tell you that we didn't always have the best material resources, but the schools love them as people. This is why homecoming means so much to them, right? Because it is a place that shaped them into adults in love and with care. The thing that you talk about with black students is that they survive predominantly white institutions, especially when you talked about folks who went to school in the 60s. Yeah. They survived, like, I can't believe I made it through here. and then the school belatedly honors them like, oh, thank you for opening these doors. But black colleges do something else, right? Earl Lloyd, who went to West Virginia State, he talked about it's like a mother, right? Black colleges love their students, right? And they student athletes. And Harry Edwards, I don't think fully appreciated what that kind of relationship. And so it was easy for him to just look at the material deficiencies that black colleges face and say, well, these are less than these white colleges.
Yeah. When I read that, I was like, wow. He was rather critical, and now, present day, I start listening to Malcolm and stuff, Malcolm X. He talks about independence. These HBCUs during Jake Gaither's time sounds like Disneyland. You got black coaches, black professors, black administrators, black president. Like, it sounds like a place of love where you can thrive and be successful. So it was really just shocking to hear those comments from Dr. Edwards. What did integration mean for black college football?
So integration means for black college football that they're getting squeezed at two ends, right? That the NFL, professional football desegregates and in robust numbers in the 40s. And so that by the 1960s, because of the AFL, it's challenged to the NFL, that we see rapid integration at the highest level of professional football. And then on the back end, at a high school level, that by the mid 60s, that the federal government is starting to force states to integrate their K through 12 high schools. And so that for a school like Florida A&M, one of the things that Jake Gaither used to always brag about, he was like, it's like a fishtail that 90%, 95%, 85% of the high school coaches in the state of Florida were my former players or Florida A&M alums. That those players their schools, black high schools begin to close, or high schools become junior highs, they begin to merge. The high school coaches become predominantly white across the state of Florida, and so they begin to send their players to predominantly white institutions, right?
Yes.
And so they are beginning to influence the direction that student athletes are going. And so that when he was getting the best players, it wasn't just because black folks had no other place to go. It was also that because Florida A&M was the best program, right. But people were also in their ear like, hey, this is the best program. Let me explain to you why you should go to Florida A&M. So that when the coaches showed up on campus and offered them a scholarship, they've only heard about Florida A&M. Right. Now they're hearing about all these other schools, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Xavier, all kinds of schools all across the country that are offering football and new, quote unquote, new opportunities for black players. And so Jake Gaither is really being squeezed. And so integration means that they limit the number, the kinds of players that are willing to come to Florida A&M. Two, we got to be very honest about recruiting black players at this particular time. They were also paying them.
The predominantly
uh,
white institutions.
Yes, they
Yeah.
were definitely they,
Mm-hmm.
the first wave were like, racial pioneers. But when it comes to by the time you get to the mid 70s, I mean the early 70s through 1980 when Herschel Walker shows up at University of Georgia, you're really talking about that the very top stratum of black athletes are being induced to go. So, many people, your listeners may have watched the ESPN 30 for 30 on Marcus Dupree, his recruitment to the University of Oklahoma, where he's, showing up in, Camaros and Trans Ams and all that
Right.
kind of stuff. Like that was pretty much par for the course. And that's hard to do because, the recruiting budget at black colleges was tiny, right? They were relying on their, networks of alumni
Yeah.
to really help them do it. And so integration slowly kind of peels its kind of talent level. And then there's this kind of general logic that the civil rights movement kind of induces. It suggests that black colleges, because of its material inequalities, are somehow inferior to these white colleges that have, so they would rather go to white colleges with better material, better dorms, better equipment, better libraries, but professors who thought that they shouldn't be here and
Right.
classmates were only happy when they tote the football,
Right.
to then a black college where they have less of those material
Well,
things,
they
but a
had the
whole
congregation, Dr. White.
exactly. And so that squeezes them. And so there are only a handful of coaches, I think, at the HBCU level that are able to like make that transition. Eddie Robinson, and one of the reasons, going back to our earlier conversation, why he's at the top is that he makes that transition for Grambling into integration. And part of it is that Grambling and Louisiana is extremely rural, and so that kind of gives it gives Eddie Robinson a little bit of inherent advantages as opposed to Jay Gaither. And then the other coach is John Merritt at Tennessee State.
Right.
And some of that's about the uniqueness of Black Nashville, and that Vanderbilt was never really a threat in the same kinds of ways that that Florida and Florida State
Right.
were, and Miami were to Florida A&M.
Integration kind of led to the end of that dominant era of black college football. Like you mentioned, where Jay Gaither had the recruiting pipeline because all of the principals and teachers at the high school level were his former players. Those schools got closed or they got changed to handed over to white folks, and they started sending the players other places. And that was kind of really the end. It's kind of like where we are today now, where black house football is kind of like the token sport. Oh, it's cute. It's not as dominant as they once were. Like, what do you think of the current iteration of black house football? We got some big names out there. Deion Sanders, Jackson State, Eddie George, former Heisman Trophy winner at TSU. Is this kind of a revival? Like, where are we today?
I mean, I think Deion is obviously getting a tremendous amount of press for what he's been able to accomplish at Jackson State. I think Deion is a unique individual for this particular moment, right? That Deion walked into a job with, to be perfectly honest, his own media cachet that no coach, black, white, or other, typically has. And Deion was able to marshal that with a real strong kind of organizational plan to turn that kind of celebrity that he already has into real action in terms of recruiting, in terms of publicity, in terms of success on the field, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said. That'll be difficult. It's been difficult for other programs to replicate at that level, but I think black colleges have been even over before Deion have been really improving in very kind of important pockets. North Carolina A&T had a run a handful of years ago where they were a problem, right? They're beating East Carolina, they're beating a number of predominantly white institutions. And then they, and like it's hard to sustain at that level for every FCS school, right? Like these runs, with the exception of maybe North Dakota State, are hard to sustain at that level. You lose your coaches, you lose your coaching staff. People are starting to pick at, hey, where are you recruiting these guys from? Look, we need to get into those spaces. And so it becomes a real challenge. But black colleges, I think, as a whole, are in another renaissance, right? That black colleges that, given the last president's hostility and the kind of racism that emerged in the last administration, and that have been on campus, Black students are really starting to consider and reconsider attending Black colleges, because they just, you just ain't got to deal with that every day. And like, as we talked about, that congregation, right, whether it's sporting or not, still exists, right? And there's a kind of cultural moment that folks are really desiring at this particular moment. And Black colleges have always done that, but their numbers are up. Enrollments up at Florida A&M, enrollments up at Jackson State, enrollments up at North Carolina A&T and Howard. And so, the question that always is going to be the limiting factor is, will the material resources, keep up in order to keep this new student population, content to stay, to graduate for the next generation? Can he turn that over? And so I think Black colleges are in a really good moment. But what does that mean for football long term? Who knows? I think that they're in the FCS level. I would like to see them be more competitive across a number of teams, not just Jackson State. And so seeing Florida A&M, seeing South Carolina State last year, seeing North Carolina A&T, like those programs need to be successful to it can't just be Jackson State carrying the water for all of HBCU. They need several programs to carry the water.
Right. I'm currently working as an assistant basketball coach at a high school here, and I'm working under one of my former teammates, one of my young homies. And it's not the most lucrative opportunity, but you can't put a price on the respect and how I feel when I walk in those buildings. And I look and I hear these coaches every offseason talk about, we need more Black coaches, or they'll give them a special assistant to the special assistant position. Like, when I read your book and I hear about these congregations, these communities, guys were respected, guys were community leaders. You know what I'm saying? Like that is amazing. And there's something in your book that I'm going to take with me forever. It said, we want to be politically integrated, but culturally autonomous. Yeah, I want the rights of a citizen, but I want to do my own thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's respect over there too.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's on, you're at this level, right? It's hard to convince young people. They at the tip of the spear, right? They control, right? Travis Hunter's recruitment to Jackson State brought more publicity to Deion than Deion did, right? Because he had flipped the number 1 or number 2 player in high school from Florida State to Jackson State. And if we could get those kind of conversations where very talented players, basketball, football, track and field, women's basketball, that they are no longer just simply attending predominantly white institutions, but they're making conscious decisions about the kinds of institutions that they have. And so I think there's a couple things here, right? One is that, coaches at the high school level have to really push, if they want to have this kind of autonomy, you got to push your best players to Black coaches, right? At HBCUs, but also at PWIs. Right. Like, we got to have more Don Staley's, right? We need to have more Mike Loxley's. We need to have more coaches that have influence, right? So many of these kids are going to the same kinds of, I work at the University of Kentucky, right?
Yeah.
And I say this all the time. I like Coach Cal. Coach Cal is honest. Like, he's like, I'm here to help these young men get the money that they deserve for their talent. Like, I like honesty, right? But at the same time, they can still take their talents to a Black coach and part of what doesn't get quite always seen is like how those networks matriculate down the level. And so what I mean is, who gets to be a grad assistant, right? Who gets to be the third assistant coach, right? Who gets to draw up plays instead of just being tasked as a recruiter, right? Like all those things, those subtle things in the way that coaches and coaching works, it operates in a space that 17-year-old kids can't see, to be perfectly honest.
Yes.
But their mentors can, right? And I think that's just laying out those decisions and not having them be overwhelmed by the fanciness of the locker room or overwhelmed by they wear Nike or Adidas or Under Armour, whatever that is, right? Or even overwhelmed by just NIL money, right? Like, like helping them understand that, like, hey, this NIL money is important. It could be life-changing. It could be necessary. That might be the decision that you need to make right now. But at the same time, what other factors should we be considering at the same time? What happens if you don't make it to the NFL or to the NBA? What happened? Like, what kind of networks are they going to be bringing? So asking different kinds of questions, like asking not about the star players, but what are the other players doing who didn't make the NFL?
For
Where
sure.
are they at? And did they graduate? Where are they at? Are they on, Wall Street? Are they community leaders? Like, that's the way you need to think about the entire corpus of decision making. And too often, and rightfully so, like, I was 17 once. You ain't thinking about, like, you ain't thinking about all that.
Yes.
And that's where your parents and mentors come in, is that, the mentors can't just be like, yo, Adidas is sliding me this money, so you should consider these Adidas schools,
For sure.
right? Like, we got to help them make better decisions, and say it's still their decision, but giving them more context and more information. And that's the only way we're going to change that basketball, that people need to start considering going to North Carolina Central, right? Like going to play for these programs or going to Howard, and thinking about how do we turn these conversations around, and it not just be elite basketball one and done decisions,
For
but
sure.
how do we have conversations about life, community development, and all that.
And I try to tell my friends, y'all need to be listening to the Black Scholars. I find the Black Scholar is probably some of the most fearless men in this country. So, Dr. White, I'm gonna ask you, what does it mean to you to be a Black Scholar? Like, how would you describe your duties, your responsibility? What's that mean?
I mean, being a Black scholar means being fully, aware of both the past, present, and future possibilities of Black communities, right? Like that we understand, because of my work as a historian, understanding kind of where we've come and where we are, and where we need to go. I think that, we do a lot. People think, what do you do as a professor? You teach these classes, you write these books. Yeah, and I mentor students. I'm in a ton of committees. I go to community events. Like, we're operating on so many different registers at the same time, that it is important, right? That's part of our calling in many cases. And so, Black men and women like myself, who are scholars, who spent years studying this information, are also public facing scholars doing this kind of work, talking to communities, talking to podcasts, in churches, in community events, both locally and nationally. And I think that is an important part. And I think that it's also, thinking about the Kyrie and Kanye thing, that the thing that's most disturbing is that they have such huge platforms. But, like Kanye was like, I don't read books. And I'm like, well, like, why are we even, like, you admitted that, right? Like, why are we even listening to you?
Right.
Because you could put words together and make these be like what we've done. And so I think that there's really a kind of disappointment and a kind of arrogance in our kind of celebrity culture, that being a celebrity or being wealthy somehow gives you particular kinds of knowledge. And there's a kind of unwillingness to humble themselves and learn. And I think that actually is the most disrespectful part of this contemporary landscape, is that, you can't just read one book. You know this, right? You
Yeah.
can't, one book ain't going to answer. If you read one book, then you need to read like hundreds more, right? You got to be constantly, surrounding yourself with new people who know more than you, and encouraging to think in different kinds of ways as you fulfill your own kind of intellectual journey. And I think I think that's part of the process. And I think that what we're witnessing right now, in this kind of public, Kyrie and Kanye moment, the kind of anti-Semitism that they are so strident about is uber problematic, because that's the same kind of the anti-Semitism, anti-blackness, homophobia, all that stuff is stemming from the same kind of hate.
Right.
And it has real consequences in this kind of particular landscape, right? Like, there are real physical, violent consequences for these communities. And so I think that, we have to be not only respectful, intentional, and intelligent, but we also have to be understanding about what the kind of intentionality can happen on the back end, for these kind of careless actions, these careless talk. And so, I think that being a scholar is a calling. In some ways, it allows for you to go in a lot of rooms, and that you wouldn't normally go into. But at the same time, it is a lot of responsibility of basically, some cases translating the past, talking to elders and understanding, helping them understand hip hop culture because they ain't get it.
Right.
But also talking to folks who grew up on hip hop, helping them understand elders and trying to see both ways. And so to circle this back to someone like Jay Gaither, being a scholar is always understanding by why students were calling him an Uncle Tom, and at the same time understanding why Jay Gaither was making that same kind of position because he saw himself as doing kind of black institutional power, even though he would never call it as such.
Got it. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jake Gaither, Florida A&M, and the history of black college football. Dr. White, where can people pick up this book? Where can they follow you? I know you got a podcast. Plug it all. Go for it.
Yeah, so you get the book on Amazon or your local independent bookstores. Bookshop has it. You can also get it from the University of North Carolina Press if you want to order directly from them. I have a podcast with my colleague and friend Lou Moore called the Black Athlete Podcast, where we talk about many of these kind of athletic issues in a kind of historical context. I'm on Twitter, at least for now, at Blackstar1906. And where I basically try to tweet, talk about what's going on in the world, and it's a good way for folks to get into the scholarly world. The best part about Twitter, at least for me, is the connections among other scholars. I'm learning something every day, seeing new articles helping me transform my thinking, and so that's kind of where I'm at. Also at the University of Kentucky, in the history department in African American Africana Studies.
Dr. White, you're the best, brother. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
All right, take care.